everyone, to another episode of Trialogues. I'm Lindsay Planetta, and we are recording from Houston here, and I wanted to welcome today first Matthew Shadbolt. Matthew is the Director of Interactive Product and Marketing at the Corcoran Group in New York City. Hi, Matthew. Good morning.
Hello, Lindsay. How's everybody doing today?
We are doing just fine. Gaylord DeWald is also joining us from Burlington, Vermont. He is the president and janitor of ThoughtBots, a strategic content studio. Welcome back, Gaylord. How are you?
Hey, Linz. It's good to hear everybody's voice.
Yes, it is. You guys are on fire on the pre-call this morning, so I'm excited about this morning's call. Rob Hahn is the managing partner of 7DS Associates. Most of us know him as Notorious Rob from his blog. Good morning, Rob. How's it going?
It's going okay. But I'm curious, what is the order exactly? Because it's not alphabetical.
I think it was in order of awesome to less awesome. Or else,
The problem is I had it written out like everyone's descriptions, and unfortunately for Matthew, he was last. So I decided to switch the order this time. Sorry, Gaylord, you're in the middle.
I'm just like a middle. I just rock the middle, you know.
I'm good with it being an order of awesomeness decreasing. I'm just curious what the order was, you know.
It's obviously in order of Englishness, right?
Oh, you figure you're like a British citizen, Gaylord's descended from, settlers.
Rob, I think I'm closer to being British than you are.
Man, the level of xenophobia and racism on this call is something that I think should be troubling for our listeners.
I don't have any trouble with the Warrior Princess.
Viva la! Come on.
I stole that joke from Matthew Shadbolt for what it's worth. I should give him credit there.
See, I knew this was going to be that kind of call.
Anyway.
Rob, would you like to start us out this morning?
Yes, ma'am. Okay, so I think, just to set a way of background, I did a podcast for Notorious TOD yesterday with a gentleman by the name of George, I'm going to try to say his last name correctly, Kalogeropoulos, who is the founder and CEO of a company called Rent Metrics. And that podcast should be up, on my site in the next couple of days. But, this company is fascinating. Right? It's like a four-man startup. They came out of Y Combinator. They've got some, significant venture backing. So, these guys are players, right? They're going to be around for a little bit, it seems like. And what they've done is they have somehow found a way to go out and gather all of the rental data throughout the country. And, where he put it, it's a mix of partnerships with portals, listing portals, so the HotPads, Zillow, Rent.com, what have you, as well as partnerships with major landlords, institutional landlords, so guys who have 100,000 units throughout the country or whatever it is. A little bit of, like phone banks, to call landlords or verify something about a specific building. And they've essentially been producing reports for Wall Street and the finance community about rentals, right? So what's the prevailing rent? What are the rent trends? What's the vacancy rate? How quickly do units go off market, once they're put on the market as available for rent, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And they're focusing strictly on rentals. But the piece of the conversation that was so interesting to me is that he said that they think, and I guess their customers agree because they are getting paid for their data, they think that their data error rate is somewhere between 2 to 5%, right? When they go and do like a manual audit to make sure, like, if we say that this unit over here is, 2-bedroom, 1 bath with a balcony, they're usually right, okay? And they're doing this without any compliance. There's no compliance department. They're not going and checking if the thing's correct. What they're doing is they're taking all of the records throughout the entire web or, electronic database everywhere. And they might get 25 separate descriptions, right? And they're doing in-depth textual semantic analysis on unstructured data, like property descriptions or marketing, language. And they're combing through it to pull out structured data and then matching it across all of the records to distill these 25 or 30 different records into one single sort of, authoritative record source, right, which they can then do data analysis on. He wasn't thinking this because he's just focusing on rentals and producing reports for big hedge funds. I heard this and I said, well, one of the biggest issues we've been talking about in the industry is data accuracy, right? Listing accuracy. And, Zillow and Trulia and MLS and brokers, all of them sort of get involved with it. And I never thought there was a sort of a technology solution to it. Apparently these guys have found one. And I wanted to kind of ask you guys, number one, whether you think that's feasible. I mean, is that even possible? And number two, if it is possible, what does that mean? Like, what's the significance of something like that?
I'd like to jump in on that one first. In terms of the is it possible or not? Yeah, this stuff has been possible for a long time. My understanding, my take on it's always been that the reason that data isn't accurate in other aspects of the industry is just that people haven't had the willpower to do it, and that could be either they don't want to do it because it's expensive and they don't feel that the market actually cares, or there's a lot of money to be made in inefficiencies, right, in the data being not exactly perfect. So, in terms of, there are things that you lose if you end up taking out all the old, removed, duplicate, whatever. So there's, that's, I think there's pieces of that. In terms of the technology to do that kind of stuff and the thinking, then, that's the way, that's just the way it is.
I think that's interesting because one of the things that I was thinking about in terms of the data accuracy conversation is that, with the advances in technology and the advances in the industry that we've seen sort of even over the last 5 years, there's been sort of this seismic level of technological change. Sort of pinning your hopes to data accuracy as either a brand positioning, form of brand positioning, or sort of that's your sort of unique selling proposition, if you like. It's sort of a risky place to be because it's a very finite type of problem. And I think what you're describing, Rob, the kind of climate that you're describing is the beginnings of data accuracy starting to go away, where there will be sort of a much broader buttoned-up sense of here is the data, and this accuracy conversation will ultimately kind of go away. So I sort of think of data accuracy as sort of a fairly short to mid-term problem that is in the process of being ironed out over, a number of years. And, the idea of having sort of standards, I guess, is starting to take shape. There's lots of back and forth about, the data accuracy at the portal level, at the association level, or even at the data entry level. And I think that's a problem that ultimately kind of goes away at some point, I think. And it becomes about what you do
Matthew,
outside of that.
I'm going to jump in on it. I think that while I totally agree with you in most aspects of that, because technology is going to deal with a lot of accuracy stuff, I don't think it's going to go away in all aspects of the industry. I think it's important to remember that some businesses, like title, for example, that is their what they do. The value that they bring is verifying the accuracy of things. But I think you're right in terms of rental businesses or regular brokerage or whatever. Maybe it just doesn't. I mean, all the people visiting the aggregator sites that are getting less than accurate information today, obviously they're okay with that. But I wonder a little bit with Rob's call with, when you bring up the idea of Wall Street or whatever in terms of maybe they need a level of accuracy that's, that comes to. But either way, I think you're right, Matthew, that it's, the technology side of it. Most of the technology to do this has been around for a long time. It's just who's got the fortitude to sit and grind through all the data itself and all the, the duplications and stuff like that. But obviously if there's money in it, someone will do it.
I think you're totally right. And I think, to Rob's point, it's almost like you want to sort of solve that thing field by field almost. It's like here's, standardized pricing information. Here's what standard size information looks like, and you just solve it sort of one by one, and that's sort of a technology problem. And I absolutely agree with you that there are people that sort of hang their value proposition on verifying data, but in terms of like perhaps what the customer sees and the way that kind of thing gets distributed, especially online, I think that's sort of approaching the 100% mark. You know,
I'm with you all the way on that.
There's velocity behind that kind of process. So,
well,
no, I think it's, you know, as we've said many times on this podcast before, when that kind of stuff becomes table stakes, it actually becomes more about what kind of insights and guidance you can provide on top of that stuff, because there'll be a point where everybody really has the same stuff, and including the customer. So it's more like, okay, so they're giving reports to, you know, Wall Street financiers and people like that. That's the more interesting kind of conversation, I think, rather than this sort of short to mid-term technology one.
Matthew, let me ask you a question about that, because I feel like, you know, you being in New York City, which is kind of this weird outlier market, you know, might actually have some real insight or information on it. As far as I understand, as we all know, New York City does not have an MLS. Right? You've got the, you know, real estate board in New York, but they don't operate an MLS. There's no, you know, there's nothing like that. That's correct, yeah?
And most of the main brokerages are also not members of NAR as a result as well.
Right. So within New York City, I mean, I know there are portals in New York, you know, like Street Easy. I know it's been, you know, very active for a couple of years. The New York Times actually is a big player in anything real estate related. We kind of know that. We know Zillow, Trulia, Realtor.com. I believe they're all in New York City as well. That's correct, yeah?
Yeah, mainly Zillow and Trulia. There are Realtor.com doesn't have too strong a presence because of some of the restrictions on being able to send content to them. But
okay.
Zillow has a strong presence, probably like number 3 after the Times and Street Easy. And Trulia is actually very, very strong in Brooklyn, especially. That's sort of more like a local insight. Is that Trulia and Rentals is very strong in Brooklyn.
Yeah, and at the same time, obviously, the 3 main brokerages, you know, you guys all have websites, and you're in charge of one of the major ones. So, you know, I guess the question I have there is, looking at it from New York City standpoint, like, is there really a difference in terms of, quote, data accuracy or listing accuracy between, let's say, Zillow.com, Street Easy, and Corcoran.com?
Yes, and I would say, you know, like most brokerages and even outside of New York City, a lot of those issues really relate to timing, you know, because you know, our own website gets updated pretty much immediately when an agent makes a change, but based on how Zillow and Street Easy take in a feed, and that can be a direct feed. It's not even aggregated, you know, through a third party. We usually send stuff direct. Just the frequency of how they update their own site, that could be daily, or it could be, you know, multiple times a day. But whatever it is, there's a discrepancy between the brokerage site and the aggregation site. And that discrepancy might only be for a couple of hours, or it might be for a week, you know, depending on who it is. And you know, the agent is ultimately the person that has to field that conversation with the customer. And on the buyer side or the seller side. Remember, the sellers are looking at their own listings too. So, you know, that's where the discrepancy comes in, is in terms of timing and how those things are actually being processed, even once we send those things out. But that doesn't exist on our own site, though.
But I guess, you know, what I'm getting at, and this is going to tie right back to what you said, is, you know, we're talking, it's a fairly minor thing. In other words, especially, let's say Zillow processes your feed, you know, every 15 minutes or, you know, every 30 minutes or whatever. So, you know, over the course of, you know, even the short term, like day by day, fact is they're going to be just as accurate, right? So, and I'm going back to kind of what you said. So it kind of seems to me that, you know, that the New York City brokerages, the agents who, you know, work in New York City area, you guys you're not putting data accuracy or listing accuracy at the front and center of your value proposition. I mean, that has to be the conclusion, right?
No, I would say data accuracy is important to us. I think it's important that customers understand that they can come to us for the most accurate data, but they can also go to other places for similar data, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, our value proposition does include accuracy. I would absolutely state that. We do a lot of things that the aggregation sites don't do, for example, as well. And we, as it relates to like some of our online stuff, there's a lot of value proposition that some of the syndication
agree, right.
don't do,
Right.
So
yeah, I mean, and obviously anyone listening to the podcast and knowing kind of, what your history and what Corcoran's done, we're all familiar with sort of the amazing sort of online marketing efforts you guys have undertaken. But it doesn't seem to me that it's not like a number one proposition, unless I'm totally mistaken about this. It doesn't seem to me that Corcoran or Douglas Elliman or any of these guys are out there saying the consumers use our site because we have the most accurate data. It almost feels like use our site because we have other things,
Yeah. Well, I don't think you need to. Yeah, I don't think you need to even necessarily, point at Corcoran for that. I think it would be difficult to find anyone in the industry where that's their selling proposition.
And it's
right?
not. I agree, and it's not an either-or conversation. It's an
right.
and conversation. It's not like we have this and they have that. It's like we have this and this and this and this. And I always say this to people, like our value proposition, whether it's at the agent level or at the brand marketing level or however we touch you as an organization, it's really at the customer service level. And accuracy is a very, very large part of that. There are other things connected to that, other experiential things, but accuracy is fairly high on that list of, how you perform customer service, especially when you're faced with your own inaccurate data on elsewhere online. Even though you're sending it, it's not being processed and sort of updated as frequently as you do your own stuff. So, I would say accuracy is very, very important, but it's sort of within the sort of Venn diagram of larger customer service items.
Right. No, and I think that's the only place I would disagree with what you guys said is I actually think there are segments of the industry where that's not the case. Right? In other words, again, the history of our podcast, of Trialogues, we've really hammered home the point that this is a service thing. It's service. Branding is about service. Right? It's customer service oriented. Everything else sort of falls in under that. But fact of the matter is, I mean, I can point to ads. I can point to commercials. I can point to, major sort of marketing efforts by, public-facing MLS websites, to major brokerage sites, to franchise sites, to, even guys like Redfin, right, where what they stake their sort of value proposition on is the fact that they have the accurate data, right? They have the platinum reference standard. And I've heard this over and over and over again outside of New York, where sort of the MLS dominates the whole conversation. So that's why I was curious about kind of, that difference between, what you guys are dealing with in New York City as well, versus what I'm seeing sort of outside New York. And then the impact of technology like this is significant, is tremendous.
One of the things, let me just respond to some of the things that you're bringing up here, because you're talking about sort of the levels of the value proposition. And I think it's important not to necessarily couch this as just a sort of Corcoran-centric thing. We're really talking about brokerage here.
Correct.
So, this is just how we think about it. When we think about data, for example, we think that there's much more value in presenting insight and guidance and sharing knowledge around the data rather than just sharing the data. So a good example of this is like a market report. Like a brokerage sends out a market report, and it's sort of like a glorified, very often it's a very glorified sort of Excel spreadsheet. Mm-hmm. And the last thing it does is answer the question, how's the market? Or should I buy now? Or something like that. It's like somebody saying to me, like, well, I'm thinking about buying in the West Village. Is it a good time to do that? And then somebody sends you an Excel spreadsheet and says, here it is. Like, there's so many people that do that, and that's data, not insight. And I think our value proposition is much more about this sort of knowledge and guidance kind of stuff than on the data side. Because this is sort of one of the things that we wrestle with when we work with the portals, for example, because they're very data-driven. They're essentially,
sure.
As we've discussed many times, they're software development companies, and they're very sort of keen to sort of make sure that we all understand that, and that's totally fine. And they've built massive businesses and audience around that idea, but the brokerage value proposition is able to leverage that, but it's very different from that, I think, which is why, we don't necessarily want to compete on data. We just, think of it as sort of a finite problem that ultimately goes away, and then because our value proposition is different. Does that make sense?
I want to jump in a little bit on that too, and one of those is the issue of data accuracy. I think, like in the consumer mind, and I don't have anything like to back this up. It's just my thinking on it, is that they assume that the data is going to be accurate, and they're surprised when it isn't, and they're upset in those instances.
Yeah,
but
that's very
they
true.
assume that it's accurate, right? So if you're going to compete on my data as accurate, it's kind of like you're competing, like they didn't even realize that was a problem, so it becomes one of those marketing campaigns around, well, first we have to convince them that they have a problem, and then we have to convince them that our solution is better than everyone else's solution. So it's kind of a weird, I think that's why we don't see that so much in the consumer-facing aspect of it, because I don't think most consumers, if you ask them, is data accuracy a problem in real estate websites or whatever, I don't think that they'd list that as their biggest issue. Again, I don't have like a study to back that up, but I'd be willing to wager a large pizza on that.
Like retail works like that, right? Like you go into a store, and there's an assumption that the price is the price, right?
Yeah.
And anytime you buy anything, especially if it has like a description attached to it, so you go into something like Target or Best Buy or something like that. There's a set of information that the consumer always assumes is correct, and there's a huge culture of that, and it is weird when the data isn't correct. It's like I go buy something from Target, and then I get home and open it up, and it's like something that I thought was in there isn't. That's very unusual, and you're sort of talking about the same thing. So I think it's just a sort of customer service assumption that is not real estate centric. It's services and product centric.
Well, I do have a data point to back up what Gaylord said, which is, I remember one of the panels here at Direct saying something along the lines of, marketing yourself on that we have accurate data is kind of like a hotel saying we have clean sheets.
Right.
I kind of assume that your hotels have clean sheets.
Right. That's why I say a lot of this stuff is just table stakes. There's an assumption on the customer's part that this is how it is.
Yeah.
And I totally agree with the clean sheets statement. They're dead right.
Yeah. One of the interesting things about all of this is the subject of rentals in general. I talked to this guy George about rental technology, and I just wanted to pull this thing out about how their technology, this sort of really deep data analytics, is able to produce these incredibly high accuracy results in terms of data sets that they're selling to Wall Street. The other part of it, though, that you mentioned, which was fascinating, mind-blowingly fascinating. Who do you imagine is their biggest and sort of the most active customer segment that these guys have, Rent Metrics? There's no point in leaving guys guessing. What Rent Metrics, apparently one of their most active sort of customer segment, the folks who are constantly calling them and clamoring for data, are large hedge funds who are out buying single-family residential. Okay. So their business went from these large multifamily operators that's got, and they're all over New York City, right? You've got these high rises with 150 units, the building's $80 million. What George said is, that's still there, and it's really important, and the sort of the metropolitan, center of city, type of players, they want all of that. But the biggest demand that he's got, that his company is seeing, are from these, investment funds that are out there buying tens of thousands of units across the country, right? And they want this data from him because That allows them to do pricing. It allows them to figure out, what's a return on investment, how quickly can we rent these things out once we buy them, out of foreclosure or do whatever it is they got to do. I bring this up because this morning, actually our producer, Lindsay, found an article that I thought was fascinating, where Goldman Sachs apparently reported that 50% of all sales last year were all cash buyers. 50%. And I'm thinking, if that's true, if half of all buyers last year were cash buyers, which strongly implies that most of them were investors, and that probably a big chunk of them are these sort of Wall Street institutional guys, doesn't that mean that the housing recovery is it's a mirage? It's actually not there? What do you guys think about that?
I guess before I would accept that at face value, not that I disagree with it or whatever, because I don't know, I guess I'd fact check that.
You mean the Goldman Sachs study?
Yeah. Well, what site did you get it from? Did you get it from the Goldman Sachs? Did you read the paper from Goldman Sachs?
I've not yet had a chance to read the actual paper from Goldman Sachs.
Right. So I guess before I got too far down that road, that's something I'd want to fact check. Just to know, you know what I mean? Like, we could say, well, what if, what if it's true? We can do that and go, talk about that. That might be interesting. But for stuff like that, just because the way that data and numbers get thrown around in a really loosey-goosey way online, that's, I would just want to fact check it. That's all.
Yeah, maybe 50% within a certain segment.
Yeah, within a certain segment, within a certain time period. And, it just seems it's pretty, that would be a difficult number to generate in a reliable fashion. And so I just would be curious to see it straight, that's what I guess that's where I'd go with that.
I guess this is the thing, even if the numbers are, and I'm going to just jump in here since it's something that I found. I posted it from the Wall Street Journal. Even if the number is high, whatever the number is, there's no question that we know that there's a huge amount of cash buyers. And I coach agents all day long, all over the country. And the cash buyer has such a significant impact on the housing market in every market, it seems like, across the country. So whatever the number actually is, there's no doubt it's really high. And this Wall Street Journal article is certainly touching on that and has me wondering, what Rob is asking, I'm wondering about. Because as soon as the cash investor says, this no longer pencils for me, this doesn't make sense, they don't have any emotion tied to it, and they start pulling their investment dollars back and saying, I'm not putting my money in here, what does happen to our recovery? And I'm dealing with a lot of agents who are facing some of those issues, and I'm curious about it.
So, I guess for the sake of sort of exploring this further, I would almost have to say, let's assume that the numbers go up. Right? And actually, I think there's enough other pieces of, I don't know if I want to call it data, but at least evidence, anecdotal evidence, in between what's going on the ground with agents and brokers, as we mentioned, and adding in the piece from Rent Metrics, where they're saying their company is getting deluged by phone calls from these big institutional guys, right, who are out there buying up properties, snapping them up left, right, and center. Let's assume that the number is actually what it is, that Goldman Sachs is not totally crazy. Right? We know that NAR has been reporting something like 30% of buyers are all cash buyers. I guess the thing about it that really concerns me about it is if investor activity is so heavy in the purchase of single-family residentials, then, to me, this is like it's a fundamental shift in kind of the housing landscape. Right? So, I don't know, let's take a place like Phoenix. If 30 or 40 or 50% of all homes that were sold in Phoenix last year were to these large hedge funds and Wall Street institutional guys, that means that the rental stock in that city has gone way up, but the sort of family purchasing stock is gone way down. Right? It has to be. Right? Essentially, these Wall Street guys have gone in and converted homes for sale into homes for rent. So
I'm gonna. This is totally outside of my wheelhouse, so I'll just stick my neck out on this one. But there's a few things that sort of come to mind. And one is, given the change in the ability for people to get housing loans over the past several years versus what they were in the boom. On one hand, it obviously would make sense that there would be more cash buyers than there would be people who are not cash buyers, because it just seems to be common sense. It would be harder to get a loan now, is my understanding. And then the other side of it that would be interesting to note is if there's a lesser or larger volume of transactions happening, and if like when we say 30% of transactions or 50% of transactions are cash buyers, if we say something like that, is it like an entire segment that disappeared because loans became difficult to obtain? Is it an entire segment that disappeared just because the pricing was all wrong, and the only people who wanted to buy or could buy, at the prices that were at the peak are people who had cash to do it? I really don't know. I mean, that kind of finance stuff isn't really it's not like my strong suit, but that's where I'd go when I think about that data, especially when you look at like a percent data, because that's a shipper number and it's based on a total volume. And so it'll be interesting to examine that as a segment. You could take a segment of it and say, well, how much of it over the past, boom bust cycle, and was the housing downturn driven by just the elimination of the people who had to buy without cash, and is that actually remained steady? Like, what's the total? You know what I mean? They're like, what's the total number of cash buys? Has that simply remained steady while the other stuff goes up and down? Like, those kinds of things get interesting to me. But I also do think you're right that if we're dealing with mostly an investment purchase of stuff, that most of the arguments about like the home is the most important financial decision you're ever going to make, and all the other kind of emotional strings that get pulled, those kinds of marketing messages might need to be tuned to a different reality there. That kind of stuff. Like, there are other people who know a whole lot more about the finance side of the housing market than I do, but as a numbers guy, that's where I start to get interested in it.
Yeah, I'll jump in on some of that marketing stuff that you mentioned as well, Gaylord, because I think, like to Rob's point, let's assume that those numbers are true. Ultimately, it's when it comes to how I think about it, I guess, is like when we think about like housing recovery, we're really talking about confidence. Right? Confidence in being able to do it, confidence that it's worthwhile, and, having, enough sort of commitment to actually, take that jump yourself and actually go make this happen. And one of the things I always sort of think it sort of resonates in a weird way and has done for a long time is sort of agents and brokerages or whomever that within the real estate industry that always say it's a great time to buy, right? I know it's sort of like a cliched thing, but I feel like I hear it all the time, and I feel like it's sort of that has some momentum behind it in regard to like some of this housing recovery conversations, especially like, for example, like what we saw last year with the march on Washington, right? The sort of reclaim the American dream thing. There's this sort of fueling the recovery and sort of trying to almost create like an artificial confidence that isn't, as Rob is suggesting, perhaps backed by actual activity. And that's not a data conversation. That's more a conversation like, what are people doing?
That's the branding, yeah.
Right. Like, what do people do? Like, what is Wall Street doing? What is going on with the money? It's not necessarily like a data conversation in the strictest sense there. So, one of the things that would be of concern to me is how, as you alluded to, Gaylord, that stuff starts to get messaged to the customer, because what you're talking about is a much protracted timeline of recovery. So I think when people start to use the word recovery, they're trying to sort of artificially fuel confidence, and recovery is sort of like, oh, right, so in a couple of years we're going to be sort of okay. And what Rob is suggesting, sort of backed up by these reports, is that when we talk about recovery, we might be talking about potentially much, much longer. And of course, what that starts to do, if it is a longer time, is it makes this idea of sort of, it's a great time to buy, and this idea of trying to generate confidence much, much harder. Much harder for brokerages, much harder for individual agents, much harder for developers. And that is potentially the challenge here, is like, how do you deal with trying to instill confidence for a timeline that's maybe like 10 years plus, for example.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's a really, really sort of interesting challenge, because it's on the consumer side, but it's also, there's to some extent it's on the technology side as well. So I'm sort of thinking about that stuff as you guys are explaining it.
Well, there's another major challenge, though, right? So let's assume for the time being, for the sake of discussion, that the Goldman Sachs numbers are, at least reasonably correct. Let's assume for the time being.
At least as good as their stuff before the crash.
What's that?
I said at least as good as their numbers before the crash.
I mean, who knows? Those boys down on Wall Street might be cooking the books, but since there's jail terms attached to doing something like that, I'm going to assume that they're not completely off the mark. Right. And if the last couple of years of activity are true, I mean, I think we can say that at least in some markets throughout the country, and I don't know about New York City, but I want to return to it in a second. At least in some markets around the country, we have seen a huge conversion of housing stock away from for sale to for rent, simply because these hedge funds have gone in and bought up, tens of thousands of units. So the secondary challenge, I think, for agents and brokers is, look, if half the housing stock in your city went from being for sale to for rent, and you don't have a rental leasing business, aren't you in trouble? And I want to bring New York City into it because I think New York has always had a very, very strong sort of rental leasing business just because of the way that market is.
Yeah, it's very true.
Matthew, what do you think? What would you recommend? What are your thoughts on if this is true and a huge amount of the housing inventory in the market is now rentals? Like, what should brokers and agents be thinking about?
Well, one of the things that we're experiencing, and I know this isn't isolated to Corcoran at all, it's a sort of citywide problem, is that the speed at which rentals are coming on and off the market is actually causing technology problems in being able to distribute these things. Essentially, they can't be posted online, distributed, and taken down before the rental unit is actually no longer on the market. So we're talking about a time frame of, in some cases, 45 minutes to an hour between the unit being available to the unit not being available. And this is from a conversation that we have at City Habitats, which is the largest rental brokerage in Manhattan. So what they're seeing is this enormous shift in terms of things coming on and off the market so fast that the technology can't actually keep up. So you try to send that to like Zillow or something, and when they have like a daily update, it's not only out of date, it's like way out of date, that stuff. So it's a really, really aggressive market right now, and it's being fueled by the things that it's always been fueled by, people in education and that kind of stuff. And it's a really interesting technology problem, I think. And in terms of like where to focus and what to think about, being able to to return to our data accuracy conversation, being able to say, here is actually what is available right now is a real challenge when it comes to like the New York City rental market. So that's something that I think the rental folks that I know of in and outside of Corcoran, they're scratching their heads in terms of like, how do we even stay on top of something like this? So it's kind of a crazy insight, the sort of 1 hour on and off.
It's almost like the rental guys need to go to something like a NASDAQ or a New York Stock Exchange, live.
That's not a bad idea, really. That's not a bad idea, Rob. That's actually a pretty good one, I think.
I mean, if I'm in New York City, maybe I can start some service that'll send me a ticker, call. Real-time inventory. I mean, it's sort of an interesting other side of that data accuracy.
And we could ring the bell in the morning and stuff. That'd be a totally New York way to do it. That'd be fun, wouldn't it?
I think Corcoran's got a new idea.
This is the market. And you could bring back the guys that are on the floor waving the papers and stuff around. That would be cool. That would be really cool.
Hand gestures, right? Make the hand gestures.
Yeah, just like have a thing to do that. Because that's a technology that's developed to handle rapid change, right?
Right.
I think the technology.
There's another. Go ahead. Yeah, go ahead. I've got another angle on that. I guess I'll throw it out there too, because I've known of brokerages doing being involved in rentals for the last few years. I don't think necessarily related to some of the things we brought up, but obviously I guess it would play in. But just in terms of grooming future customers, having I know a guy who's got a rental business because he knows that he gets people into the rental into a rental right out of college, and then later on when they start looking for a place to live, he's already had a brand established experience with them, and he also uses that as a way to train future real estate agents as well. He has like the people that go around and show the rental stuff, and the ones that are good at that, he grooms them into an agent job, which is a better job for those people. So using a rental business as a way to grow your business, both in terms of your customers and your HR. So that kind of stuff definitely makes sense and plays into the idea of the if we're going to have more rentals, then this maybe becomes an important center for revenue.
Right, but the thing is, that's exactly my point, Gaylord, is that, most brokerages that do have some sort of rental business, they're doing it for the reasons you mentioned. It's sort of, it's a loss leader for now. We're not making any money on the rental side.
Well, this guy the guy that I know of isn't doing it as a loss leader. I think doing any kind of business as a loss leader only works if you really are ready to admit that you're in a commodity business. I don't think most real estate people aren't ready to admit that they're in a commodity business yet. They're not willing to give up the ghost on that. So you can't have a loss leader and a unique business.
No, what I'm saying is, though, there's just the financials. There's just the way they work out, right? It's the rental leasing stuff. It's not that much money, but they do see it as a really important pipeline for future customers, and they do see it as training. My point, though, is that and that's been in place for years and years and years before all of this sort of changes in the industry happen. I'm saying, though, if half the inventory in your market has transitioned to rentals, owned by big Wall Street hedge funds, if you can't figure out how to make money on rentals themselves, and I bring up New York City because New York City Habitats is a great example. Those guys make money on rentals. They make money on leasing. They've developed a set of business practices. They've developed a way to get paid that actually generates a shitload of money. They're not City Habitats not looking at these renters as a future pipeline or as a way of training new agents. They're looking at this is our business. And I have a feeling that if these numbers are true, if these trends are correct, then we're going to want to learn a lot, from companies like City Habitat, from folks who've been doing really leasing and rental-focused business for a long time as a business, right? Not just as channel development or CRM or, human capital development, but as an actual sort of this is how we make our money. I think we're going to end up learning a lot or wanting to learn a lot from those guys.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And it's Gaylord's absolutely right when he says that there's a culture of agents, doing great business on the rental side and then ultimately transitioning to become sales agents. That's very true, and we see that all over the industry, of course. But it's interesting to see some of the technology starting to try and address these problems as well, I think, either from, Zillow's acquisition of RentJuice, right through to the kind of things that you're talking about in terms of Wall Street's involvement, Rob. I think it's a very interesting times for rentals, and I think it has really serious implications for what you think, what you message to the customer about buying or selling, I guess, as well. But it has really, really big repercussions on that.
I think there's a lot of there's additional information that can be mined out of the rental side as well, in that there's just going to be a greater number of transactions or a greater frequency of transactions. Right? The renters switch housing more often than the buyers do. So there's the opportunity to learn more about what are people's tastes, what are they looking for, that kind of thing, just due to the increased volume of transactions. So.
Yeah, and RentMetrics probably covers all those things.
Yeah, well, I would think they cover some of it anyway. I mean, or at least it should be mineable from there, whether they do or they don't. I think Matthew's point, back earlier, is that the difference between data and insight is is significant. A company like the one, like your friend that you were talking with on your podcast, he provides extreme value by giving people the data. The next round up, like the hedge fund, is developing insights and making more money on top of that. And other people can as well. And so the raw data itself has a certain value just because it's a pain to gather. It's inconvenient to gather. I think in the long run, those kinds of, having it built on the inconvenience of it, that may be trickier, because you move into a commodity situation with your data sooner or later. But if you've built a good system, and then you can start layering insights and stuff like that on top of it. But I think, the rental market, of course, there's a lot of interesting stuff. For me, as a web analytics guy and human behavior, examining human behavior for marketing purposes, the fact that there are, it's not 7 years in between a rental, that gives you more up-to-date information about people's tastes and stuff like that.
Sure.
There must be something. I mean, obviously it's different though, right? Like it's different. Like there are certain neighborhoods that are rental neighborhoods, right, in any town, and there are certain neighborhoods that are not. And so that, there'd have to be a lot of, interesting math and examination on it. But that's an area that I would suspect that a broker would be well positioned to try and tackle that, like from the topic domain experience side of it. If a broker, had the mindset and wanted to pursue that kind of thinking.
Well, listen, gentlemen, I'm starting to run up against a hard stop here. So, as always, these conversations are amazing, fascinating, and interesting. But I guess I want to try and kind of wrap up what we discussed, the last hour or so. What are sort of the big takeaways, I think, for us? I'll start. I think my biggest takeaway from this conversation for me is that it really still does come back to what Matthew said. Right? It's about service. It's about customer service. It's about insight. It's about things that go well beyond just data. Right? And if that's the case, then there's no reason to be afraid of companies or innovations like these web metrics guys or whatever textual semantic analysis or any of this stuff. It can't really disrupt that. I mean, for me, it feels like we keep coming back to that theme with all this change, all this technology. There's no reason to be afraid of it if you're all about the customer experience. What do you guys think?
I think you're dead right, Rob. And I sort of just want to piggyback on top of that by echoing something that resonated with me that Gaylord said as well. It's really about the layers around the data. It's great that you can sort of be the person that gathers the data and does all the sort of heavy lifting to actually assemble it all. But the real money and the real value to the customer is what happens after that stuff. It's like how you distill it into insight, how you actually, apply it to something like customer service, how you help people make better decisions. That's really where the more interesting conversation is, and that's ultimately why, the company that you spoke to has Wall Street as a client, because Wall Street are the people that are doing that because they know that they can sell it. So the commoditization of data, that's pretty familiar to a lot of people, I think. But it's the commoditization of the insight stuff is a little bit more challenging, I think, because that insight is going to be perhaps specific to the person that needs to, use the data, and it's a much more sort of niche kind of skill set, I think. So, that commoditization thing is. I'm going to be scratching my head about that over the next week or so, I think, because it's a really, really interesting conversation.
I think probably one of the big takeaway for me is that, whatever Matthew says, I'm just going to agree with. That's my first big takeaway. Yeah. There's number one. And then whatever you say, Rob, I'm going to halfway agree with, and then I'm going to take a quarter of it back when I'm done. And so just to be irritable.
75% disagreeing with me. That's right. Exactly. Just to maintain my middle position in the intro
scheme of things. No, I mean, I think for me, it's really interesting to think about, this idea of, are we shifting from a nation of homeowners to a nation of renters, or whatever it is, flags that people want to fly around that. I personally don't get involved in that, aspect of the discussion, but I think it's interesting, and I'm most interested in the idea of renters as a more frequent decision-making, opportunity, and what we can learn about how people feel about their neighborhoods or the kinds of places they want to live, or that kind of stuff. That as a customer intelligence opportunity, that I think there's some legs in there, for future development. But it's an interesting area. Yeah, I think so. I mean, again, I think there's obviously some differences in that area, but the problem I always run up against with friends in the industry is like, well, selling real estate is like a 7-year subscription. It's like you subscribe to this house, and then 7 years later you get another one, and it's hard to. How do you know what's changing in the general field? But anyway, I think it's a great topic, Rob. Thanks for bringing that one to the table today.
Well, you're very welcome, gentlemen. With that, I got to run, so I will bid all of you adieu, Godspeed,
right,
and all of that.
All right.
Awesome as always, guys.
Take it easy, guys. And Lynn, bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
It's the magic number. Somewhere in this hip-hop soul community.